some soon after independence, some like Côte d'Ivoire only just recently. And that is part of the process of trying to achieve this balance, this accountability in these countries. And a lot of the problem with EU-Africa relations has revolved around, I think, a misunderstanding of this process, which has led to a feeling of paternalism and tension in the relations, linked possibly also to the fact that the European Union includes a number of former colonial powers who have some historical baggage in their relationship. I'll come back to this point as well. The third area where things are changing is in the global environment in which the EU-Africa relationship takes place. It's not a vacuum. China, Russia, to a lesser extent, but India and Brazil and Turkey are all taking a far greater interest in Africa, largely for commercial and economic reasons, but also to some extent geostrategic. And Africa is finding itself attractive. It has a number of suitors. It has people keen to come and invest their money there. Europe is not the be-all and end-all of their relations with the outside world. And we must be aware of that in trying to build a relationship that will be beneficial, stable, and productive for the future. So those are the three sort of dynamic elements that we need to take into account in looking at the EU-Africa experience. Where do we go from here? I characterize our current approach to Africa as pulled together by the EAS on behalf of the European Union as revolving around three things: peace, prosperity, and partnership. And in terms of peace, our approach is not just conflict resolution and conflict prevention, but helping Africa build the institutions that will enable them to resolve political conflict peacefully. And this comes back to the analysis of what's been happening in Africa. And this institution building is something that we can help with. It's something that has to come from these societies themselves, but through support to building a judicial system that works, building an administration, a government structure that is capable, and enabling financial structures to be accountable, revenue raising, spending, as we have seen lately in Uganda, we were just discussing over lunch. And putting in place these structures and encouraging civil society, which always has a vital role to play in developing a stable political culture, are areas that are an integral part of ensuring peaceful development across Africa. So it's not just security, it's the much wider good governance agenda. Secondly, in prosperity, clearly our development assistance is important. For many African countries, it's the most important part of the relationship. But again, we need to look wider than that, because our future interest is going to be shifting from aid to investment. In the long run, aid is going to decrease, and investment should increase. That's in our interests, and it's in the interests of African countries. So we need to look ahead and anticipate that. So building an attractive investment climate, again, building the structures, the infrastructure, legal as well as physical, that will enable these countries to grow. Developing entrepreneurship in African countries, helping create a banking system that will provide credit so businesses can grow. All this is part of the wider prosperity agenda that the EU should validly focus on, and it goes with our trade relations as well. And the third, partnership, is basically the means by which we try and deliver those two objectives. And we partner within the EU, in all the different institutions with the member states. We partner internationally with the US, with the World Bank, the IMF, African Development Bank, the UN, with China. We pursue a partnership, have some trilateral cooperation with China, for example, on Sudan. But most importantly, with the African organizations and countries themselves, whether it's the African Union or the regional blocs or individual countries. So that's the kind of structure. I don't think that's going to change. Those just represent our fundamental interests, the sinews of a relationship that we would have with any country, whether it's Japan or Ecuador. So we need to look at how, in the future, we take account of the changing world environment on these kind of things. There is an area which is of immediate concern, and that is how we collectively, as Europe and with Africans, respond to the crises that arise all the time, the places where a stable political structure does not exist. And that will remain a fundamental interest for us, partly because it's the humanitarian aspects of a crisis, whether it's sexual violence in eastern Congo, or it's the application of very rigid Sharia law in the Sahel, in Mali. These things attract public interest. There is a political demand that we try to help people. Or if it's the droughts that hit both Somalia and the Sahel last year, there is a humanitarian imperative that we should help in these kind of circumstances. That will continue, and we must respond to it. It's a natural human response. It's also written into the EU's DNA to try and help people in those circumstances. And as often as not, there is a first response. You need to keep people alive by putting in humanitarian aid. This needs to be followed by a political and an economic response. And increasingly, the EU is pulling together all these threads, because no problem can be solved in simple terms. Security interacts with development. You need both in order to achieve a stable outcome, and you need to engage it with the politics. And this is the kind of approach we've been taking in Somalia, and why Somalia is gradually getting onto the right track. It illustrates quite well how, if we take an integrated and collaborative approach to responding to these crises, we can help move a country out of chronic instability towards at least the path towards a greater political stability. It's not there yet. Could fall off the rails, could start sliding back downhill. But at the moment, it's heading in the right direction, because over an extended period of time, we have built a relationship with the African Union, who provide the troops in AMISOM, who are driving the Al-Shabaab, effectively rebel and terrorist organization, out of control, which is funded by the EU and the US and the UN, working together. But it's an African Union-led force, provided by Ugandans and Burundians. And underpinning that, we worked with the UN and with all the neighboring countries, with Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, to put pressure on the Somali domestic politicians to actually settle some of their internecine political strife that was basically blocking any progress towards a real political settlement. And it was that international framework that forced Somali politicians to bury enough of their differences to complete a transition process, move to a federal government. It's a very weak government. It's starting to reconstruct a state from scratch. We can help with that, and we should help with that. It's in the interests of Somalis, it's in the interests of the neighbouring countries, of Africa as a whole, and it's in our interests. Because only once you've re-established a state and the rule of law in that area can the Somalis themselves bear down on the threats that are currently being posed to the rest of the world from piracy, from terrorist activities. We need to re-establish the rule of law. The rule of law needs an effective state. Similar considerations apply in the eastern Congo. You've had an area which effectively has been governmentless, and it has been a zone of great conflict. There are a number of drivers for that conflict. There's the legacy of 1994. There are long-standing ethnic differences. Violence breeds violence in itself. It becomes a repeated habit. There are valuable resources buried there that some people wish to control the distribution of. and there's been a state that was incapable of assuring the security of the people that lived there or any kind of efficient administration. We have to look at all those drivers of the conflict there, including the interests of the neighbouring countries, including Rwanda, including Uganda, if we're to build a stable future structure that will enable the people there to live in peace and start trying to develop their own lives and stop the humanitarian crisis that is recurring. Similar applies to the Sahel and the crisis in Mali. Mali demonstrates that even what we think may be a democratic, stable state is not necessarily. And it collapsed like a house of cards with a little push from a few well-armed Tuareg mercenaries returning from Libya. But it collapsed not just because of them, but because the whole structure was rotten from the inside. And we, in helping the Malians reconstruct a state, once a country falls apart, it's much more difficult to put it back together again. And in this sort of Humpty Dumpty task, we have to help the Malian politicians find a way that they can rebuild a political structure that people will trust. They can rebuild an army that can effectively defend its own people. And we can generate enough economic development in that space that it's not more attractive to take Europeans hostage or to run drugs through there. But at the moment, again, in northern Mali, you have an ungoverned space. And drug trafficking, terrorist training, all kinds of criminal activities can flourish there undisturbed by any rule of law. And that's not desirable for the Malians. It's not desirable for the countries around about, who may suffer from contagion. It's not desirable for Europe, because the drugs and the terrorists may end up here. So again, we can only solve that problem if we work with the regional organization, ECOWAS, if we work with the United Nations, if we work with the African Union. And again, we have levers we can deploy, which are all the instruments we have through our development program, our humanitarian support, our political dialogues with these people, and through the security initiatives that we're able to take, training the Malian army. This is the way we need to work in the future. And it's better if we acknowledge that the EU's role is to play an